Thanks, Simon, and good evening, my dear brothers and sisters in our Lord Jesus Christ and our dear young people. Well, Job has had a lot happen in his life in the last few months, hasn't he? He's lost every possession that he owned. He lost most of his servants, all of his children, potentially the respect of his wife. He lost his health and even has been in continual pain. We can't imagine the heartache that he's been through that has enveloped his whole life during this trying time. He's been on a roller coaster of emotion. One minute he's in the depths of the despair and wishing to die. The next minute he's riding the highs as he paints a glorious picture of what God is like. He goes through chapter by chapter of speeches with his three friends. They were not very friendly at all. Maybe wanting to comfort him, he called them miserable comforters. Perhaps with the best of intentions, but because of their lack of understanding of God's plan, who develops people through trial, they failed to help. And during those long speeches, he professed his innocence and justified himself not worthy of such suffering. And he said, "Try me and I'll come forth as gold," indicating that there's probably very little dross in his life to remove. So in order to set things straight, Job retaliated to his friends' questionings and statements, and he wanted a mediator to hear his cause. And we saw a lot of that slide last week. He wanted a mediator to arbitrate between him and God. And he got one, as we saw last week. He got Elihu. It wasn't exactly what he wanted either. He was expecting a mediator to argue his cause, to take his cause before God and show that Job was good and righteous. He wanted all to see that he was not an unrighteous person and for God to vindicate him. And Elihu comes along and says, "Well, hang on a minute. It's actually not like that, Job." And he offers new information that he never heard from his three friends. And it was Cyril Tennant who said that Elihu's part is to prepare Job for the fuller teaching which was to come from God, which we read the first chapter of that tonight with Brother Simon, to make him aware of God's absolute supremacy and of man's complete dependence upon him, to show that each stands condemned before God, but that he is a God of compassion and willing to show mercy to all who seek it. The three friends talked nothing about that at all, but Elihu showed that. And as we saw from our chapter breakups of Elihu, just a statement for each chapter, we saw some lovely statements without going into any detail because of time, where you got the discipline of suffering in chapter 33. You got the question of motive in 35 and the purpose of pain. And Elihu paints a picture which God is going to do more so tonight, to show that there is purpose in suffering, there's purpose in trial. God has been in control of this whole situation, Job. You just need to appreciate what's going on here for your betterment. Job wanted a meeting with God, and he said, "I'd like to summon God and actually talk to him." And he said that many times, even though he calls him the Almighty and he uses names and titles, he wanted a meeting with God to actually, even to his judgment seat, his dwelling throne, and state his case before God. And just like with Elihu, he didn't get what he expected. He doesn't get the type of meeting that he was wishing for. In fact, he gets God in a whirlwind, as we saw in chapter 38 and verse 1. And God doesn't bring the book that Job was hoping to see as well, the book that said not guilty on it. God doesn't bring that book. In fact, God educates Job in a completely different way. And it's our fabulous opportunity tonight to do those 4 chapters of Yahweh's speech. So here's our structure, which we've had for the book of Job. And as you can see, chapters 38 to 41 is where Yahweh educates Job. He's gone through a whole series of events lasting at least 2 months, as we saw from one of those chapters. It's gone on for a while. But now he gets the attention that he deserves from God. God has a last say, as he should. God speaks last. It's his turn in chapter 38 and verse 1. When Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, so God's now in this whirlwind and he speaks to Job. He finishes off the speeches as he should. A lot of unfounded statements have been said by the three friends and even by Job himself as well. No one knew the original context in the first place. No one knew the conversation between God and Satan in the very first place. So everything that's been said has been pure supposition. They've made things up. Yes, they believed in God. They believed that God was great, but they made up all this reason for Job's suffering, and so did Job. So Yahweh is now going to set the table straight. It is his way to do it. It is his way and not man's way. It's not the way that we would expect. It's not the way that we may want. But Yahweh elevates the mind to a higher level of thinking, and it is fabulous how God does this. So he comes out of the whirlwind in verse 1. Now, Elihu actually reminded him of that. If you go back to chapter 37 and verse 1 and 2, through his speeches, Elihu said something great is coming. And look at verses 1 and 2 of his last chapter, his last speech. At this also my heart trembleth and is moved out of his place. Hear attentively the noise of his voice and the sound that goeth out of his mouth. There's a whirlwind coming, Job, and God is going to thunder greatly with his voice. It's also in verse 9 as well of this chapter. Out of the south cometh the whirlwind, and cold out of the north. And Elihu can hear it coming, and I have no doubt Job can hear it coming as well. And so when you get to chapter 38, verse 1, Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. It's just interesting, and there's some really key phrases that we need to get right, which helps us for these speeches tonight and understanding the whole book of Job. Elihu's speech in chapter 37 is that good, but we just don't have time to deal with it. But I just want to direct your attention to two verses. Verse 19 of chapter 37, Elihu said, teach us, Job, what we shall say unto him. You want to talk to God? Well, teach me. Teach the three friends here. Teach us what we should say to God. For we cannot order our speech by reason of darkness. We don't understand everything. We don't get it. I certainly don't. What do you want me to say to God? He says. The NIV actually says, Job, tell us what we should say. We can't prepare our case because our minds are dark. We don't understand everything. Should he be told that I want to speak? Would any man ask to be destroyed by him in a debate? So as Job wanted to debate with God, Elihu picks it up and says, well, you sure? Because even I wouldn't want to do that, says Elihu, as he tries to educate Job on this thing. Yet Elihu just finishes off with a beautiful touch in verse 23, where he says, touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. It's true. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. He is excellent in power and in judgment and in plenty of justice. Job, if you had a debate with him, he would win hands down. You would lose. But look at the way he finishes off beautifully at the end of verse 23. He, that is God, will not afflict. That word afflict there means to crush. You know, God might win the debate. Not might, God will win the debate. But he won't crush you, Job. If you direct your heart and mind in the right attitude toward him, he's going to educate and not crush. And I think that's a beautiful way that Elihu sees the attitude of God in these things. God would win the debate, hands down. But he's not going to crush Job. He's educating him all the way through this process and helping him. So therefore, he says in verse 24, men do therefore fear him, but God won't respect any of those that are wise at heart. Job, you need to change your ways. And so God starts his speech then, as we saw in the whirlwind in verse 1 of chapter 38. Actually, I'll give you the speech's outline. I didn't say that. Chapter 38 is inanimate creation. God talks about creation. Chapter 39 is animate creation, animals. Chapter 40 is Behemoth, and 41 Leviathan. And God is going to do that. But look what he says in verse 2. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? And the answer is Job did. If you flick over to chapter 42 and verse 3, Job actually did utter words without knowledge. Now this is Job now speaking in chapter 42 and verse 3. He says, who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Quoting God, which incidentally quoted Elihu back in chapter 35. And Job says, well, therefore have I uttered things I understood not, things too wonderful me which I knew not. And so Job acknowledges that he said things that were out of his comprehension, out of his grasp, which Elihu had already said as well in chapter 35 and verse 2. And when you go back to chapter 38 and verse 2, the word, who is this that darkeneth counsel? The word counsel there means advice, or by implication, plans. The NIV translates verse 2 this way. It says, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? And that's really important that we get that right, brothers and sisters, because he's saying, Job, you're obscuring my plans with your lack of understanding on this subject. God always knows the bigger picture, brothers and sisters. We only see the here and now. It's very hard for us to see into the future. God does. He knows the bigger picture. He is omniscient and all-knowing. It was not Satan who inflicted Job with the pain in the first place. God did it because God knows what is best. Now on this slide here, ignore everything else on this slide, just the bit that I've highlighted there. So this comment there that both claim that Job spake without knowledge of God's plans. Elihu said, I think I've quoted it wrong, 34 verse 35, 35 verse 16, God said, and also Job acknowledged. And what it's showing is that Job failed to see God's plan with him, or with anyone for that matter. What is that plan? What is Yahweh trying to achieve, brothers and sisters, in our life? What is Yahweh trying to achieve with his plans? And Stephen Irving, in his book, The Endurance of Job, just has a wonderful couple of slides on this. The problem for Job was that he had no other written scriptures from which to develop an understanding of this doctrine of redemption and glory through suffering. He could not understand that his trials were preparing him for an even greater glory than he had experienced hitherto. Therefore, he remains in frustrated anger on the ash heap. Yet Job's mind was being prepared to understand this great revelation of God's purpose. This was the path that he was being led along, but he could not yet see. The friends could not imagine such a path existed, and so they failed their friend in his hour of need. It was a path that Elihu tries to explain, but which eventually God makes clear to Job. And so God's plan with us, with Job, with everyone, brothers and sisters, is redemption through suffering. The suffering and then the glory, as we know that Peter said in 1 Peter 1 verse 11. Just have a look at an example of this in John chapter 16. You can kick your hand in Job if you like, but we've done it a few times now. I'm sure you know where it is. John 16, our Lord just has a lovely little picture comment here of suffering and then glory. Verse 21, Jesus Christ says, "A woman, when she is in travail, hath sorrow, because her hour is come. But as soon as she is delivered of the child, she remembereth no more the anguish for joy that a man is born into the world. And ye now therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no man taketh from you." A trial is therefore necessary. It's not a necessary punishment for past sins, or necessarily, but it's an education process preparing us for the future. And there might be difficulty, as it is in delivering a child, but once that child is born, that pain goes away. And so Stephen Irwin goes on to say, thus we see the correct response to suffering is to see that it as a creative force rather than a destructive one. The pain of childbirth is quickly forgotten because of the outcome, while the pain of kidney stones tends to be remembered. The absence of any apparent creative purpose tends to make the pain worse. But we have to let the creative purpose of suffering work its effect in our life. So the point is, and this is why God goes on with a whole few chapters of creation aspects, is because suffering is about creating something. It's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. It's developing character that we may have never felt that we needed before, or it's developed characters that we never thought that we'd ever use before in our life. And it's brought out things in our life that we can help others and work with others in our lives. It's preparing us for future glory. Even Christ was taught this, about the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow. Or as we quoted in Hebrews with our title slide, he learned obedience by the things in which he suffered. And Christ had the same nature as us, and every time he suffered, it kept him obedient to his God. It didn't make him more obedient, he was obedient from day one. But every time there was trial or difficulty, it kept on teaching him to be obedient to his God that he loved. Job didn't understand this. He didn't get this. His three friends certainly didn't help that they thought he was a bad sinner, and so were his children. It's a plan, brothers and sisters, that began with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's continued through the ages as Yahweh, in his loving grace and mercy, is developing us to be ready for his kingdom and glory. Can you imagine Job in the kingdom, brothers and sisters, being told this quote? Imagine Job being shown this. It's just a light affliction, Job, and it's prepared you for this greater glory. How much is that quote going to mean to Job? When he's there, he's been through it all, more than what we could ever imagine. A light affliction, Job, is prepared for greater things. So we go back to Job 38, and we divide up the speeches, just a little bit more detail for you now. God speaks in two speeches. It's not directly 38 and 39. It actually the first speech delves into chapter 40 up to verse 5. And then the second speech is from verse 6 of chapter 40 through to the end of 41. You'll see a slide of that shortly. So we've got the opening challenge where he says, who is this, as we saw in verse 2, and then verse 3, gird up now thy loins like a man, I'll demand of thee, answer thou me. And Job doesn't really answer God. He tries to, but it's unsatisfactory. He has to learn more. And then God delves into inanimate creation, stars and things that don't move or breathe, showing his universal power. And then later in the chapter, into chapter 29, he deals with animate creation or animals, things that live and move and breathe, which talks about his universal care. And Job is now going to be shown in a remarkable way about his sufferings and about the glory of God and about the glory that will follow through creation. It's almost bizarre on the surface, but we'll show you a slide after this first round as to why God has done this. It's quite brilliant. Because God in his speeches doesn't answer any of Job's questions. All the questions that Job asks, God doesn't answer. He doesn't answer any of the issues in the debate directly. God has no need to defend himself. God is greater than man. He doesn't need to. There is always purpose in everything that he does, yes, but he doesn't have to tell us everything. He just expects us to trust him and acknowledge him in all our ways, and he'll direct our paths. So what God does is show Job how great he is, and that all along as he's been working with creation, he's been working with Job as well. And so what we're going to do, I nearly had a slide for each one of these facts, but I decided to put it all on one slide to make it easier for you. Is that now we go into verse 4 to 7, he talks about the earth. Sorry if the wording's a bit small there, it's hard to squeeze it all on. This is all inanimate creation. These are the predetermined actions of creation. It does exactly as God has planned and created. He created the earth not in vain, that it might be inhabited by men and women who love and fear him. And all the way through this chapter, as we've shown the first one there, but he asks questions, and I've coloured in all the question marks there, but he says, where were you? Can you do this? Do you know this? And the first one he talks about is the earth. And he says in verse 4 to 7 that the earth is well laid out. The key words is the word laid and the word measured there in those verses. Look at verse 6. Who laid the cornerstone thereof? Or verse 5. Who laid the measures thereof? The whole earth has been measured. It's perfect balance and perfect measures. Creation is well planned. Everything measures perfectly. In fact, in verse 6, you can take the natural and the spiritual out of verse 6, where he talks about who laid the cornerstone thereof. In the natural, it's talking about the earth's building blocks that hold it all together. It all stays there. It doesn't fall apart. It also is talking spiritual about Christ, the Saviour of the world, is the chief cornerstone. He's already in the planning stages. It's all about God's plans. And so the lesson to Job is if God can do this on a large scale, what's he doing for you, Job? So then the next section, verses 8 to 11, he talks about the sea. So it goes from the extents of the earth to the sea. And we see that in verse 8. Who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? The sea is perfect. It doesn't move out of its bounds. Sea has doors to keep it in place. They're not literal doors, but God has set that. It's part of his nature, his creation. Verse 10 from the NIV, it says, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place. See, the sea doesn't go beyond its bounds, Job, beyond the limits that God has set in creation. It's behaved the same for 6,000 years. It hasn't changed. And so the lesson for Job is that God is true and faithful. He sticks to his own principles and character. Trust him, Job. And so God goes through all these things of creation just to show Job that he is greater. Just trust in him, believe in him. As he had a great plan with the earth, he's got a plan with you as well. Verses 12 to 15, he talks about the sunrise. Best part of the day, isn't it, darling? Sunrise. Smiling. Morning and day spring he talks about in verse 12. It's the sunrise that appears every day. But not only is it just a sunrise that appears and it's miraculous and it's lovely, but he talks about how it highlights the wicked and it turns darkness into light. So verse 13, you got that the wicked might be shaken out of it. Or in verse 15, from the wicked their light is withholden. And so God's light dispels darkness, it dispels wickedness. So the wicked is there twice, and just as sunrise appears, God's light reveals wickedness in dark places. Sunrise puts light on everything that was once in darkness. Sometimes we hide secret sins, and one day God will reveal them in his light. Sometimes we may not realise the darkness of our actions or our thoughts, like Job. God knows them already and may reveal them to us to help us and develop our character in time to come. And so the lesson for Job is nothing is hidden from his eye. We should be more God-conscious of life, whereas Job was God-conscious, but he was more self-conscious than God-conscious. Verse 16 to 18, he then talks about the extremities of the earth, from one end to the other part of the earth, particularly underwater. Look at verse 16, he says, hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? The word springs there means fountains. And the word depth there means, at the end of the verse, means the deepest part of the sea. So even below the seabed, there's more caverns, there's more fountains, more areas which man has never explored. And verse 17, where it talks about the gates and the doors, it refers to underwater caves and chasms. And mankind, even though we've travelled all over the world and we've gone to many places in the world now, God says, you'll never get to every cave and chasm, you'll never get to every part of this earth in which I've made. There will always be untouched areas of wilderness that man has never been. And so the lesson for that Job was, well, neither should we expect to know God's boundless mind. His ways and his thoughts are higher than ours. Verse 19 to 21, he goes then to light and dark as well. And the idea is that light and dark can't be contained. You can do it in a room, you can turn out the lights, put on a flashlight, you can control it that way. But the natural creation, the sun, moon and stars, you can't change. And so he says in verse 19, where is the way that light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? You can't contain light and day. They are the natural phenomenon of creation. Verse 20, he says you can't bind it. The word bound there means you can't put a boundary or a limit to it. The earth will keep on rotating for 24 hours a day, and it'll create light, dark, and it won't stop until God wills it if it's ever needed. And so the lesson for Job in that is neither can we limit the wisdom and power of God. You can't put a bound on it. You can't limit it. Just as the sun rises and goes back down the next day, it just keeps on going. You can't limit God. Verse 22 to 23 deserve a lot more time on their own. It's all about the weather. It's fabulous, actually. It talks about the snow, hail, wind, rain, lightning, thunder, dew, ice and frost. You could spend half an hour just on snow and the snowflake and hail and all those sorts of things. There's lots of spiritual lessons in that. And they're all natural things which happen, and we love it this time of year. Even though it's cold here in Adelaide, we know that 20 centimetres of snow fell at Falls Creek last night. And another 50 is going to get dumped over the weekend over there for those who love snow. There's fabulous things when it comes to weather and nature. But what God is also teaching, look at verse 23, it's also for judgment, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war. And so God can also use the weather for his heavenly artillery, and that's going to happen in Ezekiel 38 with Armageddon. But he also uses it for blessing. Look at verse 26, to cause it to rain on the earth where no man is. It keeps on happening. Even where man isn't, God's rain goes down. Even where man isn't, nature still happens, Job. And Job's in his little box here, in his little area there, and God's trying to get him outside of his box to see a little bit more. And so great blessings will be there in the kingdom age as far as the weather goes as well. Verses 31 to 33 then starts talking about the stars. When I was a kid, I'd go to the library all the time. There's 3 types of books I always loved reading. I wasn't in the truth, so it wasn't the Bible. I loved reading about ghosts. I loved reading about UFOs, but I loved reading about stars and planetary systems. And this is fabulous, but we can only just talk about it. Pleiades and Orion, they're constellations which can be seen by the naked eye. Mazzaroth and Arcturus are actually planets, which can also be seen by the naked eye as well. But the key words there are bind and loose in verse 31, bring forth and guide in verse 32. You can't do that, Job. You can't bind. You can't tell them to stay still. You can't stop them from moving. They are fixed and do whatever God has made them to do. Job, neither can you tell God what to do. See the bigger picture, Job, and appreciate his guidance. Just as he guides the constellations and the stars, this earth that's revolving around the sun, he can guide you as well. And there's not terror in that. There's comfort in that, brothers and sisters, that Job is learning. And then he talks about the clouds as well. Neither can we tell the clouds where to drop rain. We can't tell the lightning where to strike. It goes where it goes. It happens where it happens, all part of God's nature which he's designed. So neither tell we God what to do. We can pray to God. We can plead to God. We can ask God many things like Habakkuk did. We can earnestly plead, but we can never tell God what to do. He will provide as necessary. And we just quickly gone through inanimate nature there. Why does God do this to Job? And obviously there's lessons which we've tried to explain, and hopefully they've been helpful. But why do this? And I think there's 3 clear reasons why God does this, and then he moves on to animals next. One is distraction. By taking the focus of Job's sufferings, he gets to think outside the box of his own life and see a bigger picture. Job's in agony. And we've put up the slide a couple of times, haven't we, about all the things that's happening to his body with all the sores and the pus that's dripping off him. So God uses creation as a distraction. And it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? You start talking about nature and places, it lifts the mind, it elevates the mind, and it takes your mind off of the current suffering. So God is brilliant how he does this for Job. Not only that, he does it for the creation purpose, as we showed from Stephen Irving's comment. Suffering is not a destroying thing, but rather it's creating something in us. It's developing and building characters that we may never have utilised before. So suffering isn't a bad thing, it's a good thing. It's a creative thing, and that's why God uses aspects of creation. Job, you're being created, you're being developed, you're being educated by these things. And also it's all about provision as well. As God has provided for every animal and aspect of creation, he does it also for every human, that they might respond to him in glory, in giving him glory. I think those 3 things are the criteria to take in when you look at these speeches of God as he goes through these chapters about inanimate creation, animate creation, then Behemoth and Leviathan shortly. Well, let's go to the animate creation. Did you see that slide? Did you see that last bit? It did something weird for me. Maybe it's the glasses. He now goes to animate creation. Unfortunately, this should be the start of chapter 39, but man in his wisdom decided that shouldn't be yet. But now he goes to animals. And once you have them, it seems to work in pairs as well, which is quite fabulous how it works. So the first ones mentioned are the lion and the raven. You think, well, as a pair, how does that actually work out? Well, the point is that the lion and the raven are fed by God. The key words are food and providing. So in verse 39, you've got, wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion? Job, can you get his prey? No. Or fill the appetite of the young lions which are back in the den. You've got food also in verse 41. Who provideth for the food for the raven when his young ones cry out unto God for food? So you've got food provided for the lion and the raven. And the point that the 2 are put together is because the lion hunts his own food provided by God, while the raven scavenges off the lion's food provided by God. And so the example, or the lesson is that Job is being taught here is that our example through suffering could be helpful to others. So here's an innocent animal, we would say, has died to help feed the lions. When the lion walks off, the ravens come in and eat the rest of it. And when the ravens are finished, then the worms come along. And when the worms are finished, in the end, and you know the story. And so there's always suffering that can help others out. And so Job is being taught this in a great lesson, that your suffering, Job, is going to help generations of people. And when he's shown that wonderful quote in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he's going to see the great help that Job has given us through his suffering in his time of need. You go to chapter 39, verse 1 to 4, and now we have the goat and the deer put together. In verse 1, notice now the time when the wild goats of the brook bring forth. So it's talking about birth. Or canst thou mark when the hinds there is the deer, do calve. So it's about birthing. So we've got two animals. The context is about giving birth. The words bring forth is in verse 1. It's also in verse 2. Canst thou number the months that they fulfill, or knowest thou the time when they bring forth? And it's also in verse 3 as well. They bow themselves, they bring forth their young ones. So it's all about giving birth. And the point is, it doesn't matter whether it's a goat, a wild goat, that has its young out in the rocks, or a deer that's a very vulnerable deer and that's always in fear of, because it's a very delicate animal of predators. God provides birth and protection for both. And the miracle of childbirth is available to all and is a witness to the existence of God. All types of people, Job, have life no matter what type of character they are. Verse 5 to 12. We got the wild donkey and the ox, that they seem to be put together. The key is the word house. Verse 6, it talks about whose house I have made in the wilderness, and the barren land his dwelling. So it's talking about housing for these two animals. The wild ass was an untamed and free animal. It was of no use for anyone. Man can't use a wild ass. It's impossible. But God still cares for it, Job. He still gives it protection. He still gives it a place for protection. And in verse 9 there we have, will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib, or in thy manger? No, you can't house it. God's given it its own provision out in the wilderness. The word unicorn there is the Hebrew word reem. Katie, you can fix me up on that later. But it's called the auroch, or auroch, A-U-R-O-C-H. It's an old ancestor of the cattle that we know today. Apparently it was hunted into extinction by the 1600s. They were a huge animal, looked like just an oversized cow, growing up to 2 metres tall. You couldn't tame them, you couldn't put a yoke upon them to use in the field. They lived out in the wild, they were no use for man or for servitude. Man only killed them for eating. God still provided shelter for them. It's fabulous, isn't it? The majority of people on this earth are wild and untamed. There's a majority of people that won't be in the kingdom upon this earth. God still provides shelter and basic needs for them. Those basics are always available unless hindered by the greed of man, as we know that happens in some places of the earth. God loves his creation, brothers and sisters and young people. Think about all the other animals that Job didn't even know existed, like here in Australia, like kangaroos and echidnas, or over in America and Canada, like raccoons and squirrels, and any other place. He did not know, and yet God was protecting them at the time, giving them their provision at the time as well. Job had no idea. He's in his own little cocoon, his own little box, and God's trying to develop him and see the bigger picture and all these things. Verse 13 to 18 is the stork and the ostrich are put together. It's really, really a great reading, actually. Now, you've got to get this right. The word peacocks in verse 13 is actually the ostrich, but the word ostrich in verse 13 is the stork. That's how the concordance said it to me anyway. And the translators actually translated in that order as well. So the peacock is the ostrich and the ostrich is the stork. The NIV says, the wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. And these two birds are put together, two totally different animals. They both got feathers. One can fly, the other can't fly. The ostrich can't fly, he's like the emu. Their wings are redundant, but the stork's feathers are so streamlined, it can ride the thermal currents for days and weeks on migratory flights. And it just keeps on going and flying, hardly has to flap its wings, whereas the ostrich can flap and flap all day long, it will never get its feet off the ground. The stork will fly to exact locations that it has been before. It has incredible homing skills. It goes for long distances without food and is rarely attacked because of its speed. Whereas the ostrich, it also can protect itself by its incredible speed and has great leg speed as well. The ostrich has a negative aspect to it. As we read in verse 14 to 16, it leaves its eggs in the earth, warms them in the dust. It doesn't even build a nest or dig a hole in the ground. It forgets that the foot may crush them or the wild beast may break them. She is hardened against her young ones as though they were not hers. Her labour is in vain without fear. So the ostrich is not very good at protecting its eggs. She just lays them on the ground, easy for walking on and food for predators. And so as verse 17 says, well, God didn't give the ostrich a great deal of wisdom and understanding like other animals. But that, of course, gives us great lessons in the antithesis as well. Now, Job may have considered some people walking around him being like ostriches, and perhaps he would never have helped them. Job's been taught in a real way to help all people because God does. And so the lesson is God still does, he still gives. It's his creation, he cares. And even when Job was living in his little box, in his little area, right out in the middle of Australia, God's looking after the flies at Ayers Rock. And we've seen thousands of them there ourselves. Verse 18 then is included on the next bit. Verse 18 to 25, we've got together the ostrich and the warhorse. Because these two are known for their speed. So the ostrich sort of goes across two sets of scenarios there. So the warhorse is contrast with the ostrich of verse 18. The ostrich runs from their enemy in fear. They have great speed by its legs. The feathers don't help it at all. But the warhorse is fearless. And the key word is strength. That's in verse 19. And it's also in verse 21. In verse 20, you can't make him afraid. And in verse 21, it rejoices in its strength. Verse 22, it mocks at fear and is not affrighted. It's an amazing animal, is this warhorse. So the NIV, now if you want to look at verse 24 and 25, I'll read the NIV at the same time. In frenzied excitement, it eats up the ground. It cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. At the blast of the trumpet, it snorts, aha! It catches the scent of battle from afar, the shout of commanders and the battle cry. And so when the battle trumpet goes off, the warhorse is ready, and he's ready for action. You can't hold him back. It has a reckless indifference to its own personal safety. The ostrich, however, in fear, will just run the opposite direction. It has great speed running the opposite way. The warhorse has great speed running towards the battle. And so the lesson that Job is being taught with these two is that God provides courage for both. And all types of people exist in the truth, don't they? God provides different abilities for all. Everyone is of use in the ecclesia. There are those in the ecclesia, like the warhorse, that you never want to have an argument with. But you'd be more than happy to go into battle with and follow in behind them because of their courage and their fearsomeness. And there are great examples of those that when trouble arises, like the ostrich, run the other way. And you follow them as well when trouble arises and get away from evil. And we know Job eschewed evil, didn't he? So you can see how there's great lessons in that for Job. And now Yahweh finishes off his review of animate creation with a consideration of two birds of prey, the hawk and the eagle in verse 26 to verse 30. The hawk is in verse 26 and the eagle is in verse 27 to 30. The hawk has laser eye vision in verse 26. Job's asked, does the hawk fly by thy wisdom? and stretch out her wings toward. Is it your wisdom, Job, that has done this? No, it's my wisdom that has done this. I've made them this way. 2 birds of prey, but with great eyesight, but doing 2 different things. Job could never have imagined or dreamed up this sort of idea. It's all about God's wisdom. In verse 27, the eagle also travels to great heights to protect its young from predators, and it puts its nest on high. And we know that the lesson, don't we, that we're born on eagle's wings. And when we fall out of the nest, God is like the eagle who catches us and carries us and puts us back in the nest again. He cares for us. And Job's learning these things with these animals. And the eagle precariously places its nest on side of cliffs. When the young are born and ready to fly, it catches them when they fall out. When they are struggling while learning, it catches them again and puts them back in again. And so we are also born on eagle's wings. You can see a mouse or its prey in verse 29, a mouse from a kilometre away. But it's also an unclean animal, a bird of prey, but God still cares for them as well. So therefore, why finish with 2 birds of prey? It was because they're unclean animals, and God finishes off animate creation with 2 unclean animals. Because Job is being told that God is working with all types of people. He can't pick and choose who comes into the truth or not. Peter learned that lesson in Acts chapter 10, didn't he, with that vision? And they were taught below the gospel goes out to the Gentiles as well. I remember handing out leaflets in Victoria Square many years ago and quite frightened to give certain people a leaflet. I think, are they going to beat me up or not? They didn't. They took the leaflet, and you learned. Everybody is to be called, not just the ones who we think fits that mould. And so Job has been taken right out of his mould, out of his box, and is learning a lot of unbelievable lessons. So when you sum up all these things about creation in these two ideas, animate and inanimate creation, God made them all different and gave them what they need to survive. They're not treated the same. Think about that. God gave them what they needed to survive. Different climates, different abilities, different areas, some in the water, some out of the water, some flying, some only on the ground. God has created every animal different for his glory and wonder. But as Job is learning, he still provides for every animal as well as human beings that might glorify him back. Animals do that automatically. They do as they're told, as they've been created. Humans don't always do that. We like to do things our way. We like to do things the way we want them done. And we all have different characteristics. Therefore, God doesn't treat us the same. What is a trial for one family or one individual is not for another. The whole plan is to get us all into the kingdom, and God will do whatever it takes. And as Acts 14 verse 22 says, through much trial and tribulation must we enter into the kingdom. And we will get there, brothers and sisters. God is doing everything he can to get us there. But very few of us will suffer the same things. We'll go through them in different times of life. God knows what's best. And what a huge lesson that is for Job. And he's starting to get the point. So when we go to chapter 40 and verse 1 and 2, God closes his challenge to Job. I'll give you the breakup at the same time. Moreover, Yahweh answered Job and said, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? Can you tell me anything, Job, after I've gone through all that? No. He that reproveth God, let him answer it. There's a lot of ambiguous words there. We don't have time to deal with it all properly. But Job's answer is in verse 4 and 5, where he says, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice I'll proceed no further. And it seems like on the surface that Job's got the point and he's learned his lesson. The word vile there in verse 3 means light or small. So he recognises how small he is compared to Almighty God. God's just shown him how great he is. Job says, yeah, I am small compared to that. And so therefore in verse 5 he says, I will not argue my case with God anymore. Not once, not twice, I'll keep my mouth shut. Because he said quite enough already. You know, God's not finished with Job just yet either. And this is a very unsatisfactory answer in verses 3 to 5. And on the surface, it seems a great thing. And we've got a great slide at the end, but we won't see that one. that seems that Job is saying all the right things, but he's not. Because if Job was saying the right things, God would stop. It'd be finished. But God goes on now and talks about two unbelievable animals to humble Job just that little bit more. He continues. What? Hasn't Job conceded defeat? Has he not recognised that he's small and God's great? No, it's still unsatisfactory because Job still thinks he's right. And God knows that Job is still filled with pride. So God addresses these two in the next few statements. Verse 8, he talks about Job's righteousness. Look at this. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? Job, I know you still think you're right. Just because you said I'm vile, that doesn't mean anything. I know there's still in you that you think that you're right. He's actually not condemning God. Remember, Job never cursed God. I think if Job ever did curse God, he'd be gone straight away. God would sort him out. He never did. So the ambiguous language of verse 8 is really, I think it's really more saying that, Job, you're on shaky ground. The more you justify yourself, the more you're actually declaring me wrong. Think about what you're saying, Job. The more you put yourself on a pedestal and say how great you are, the more you're saying that you're better than me. You're on shaky ground. And so God proceeds to educate him just that little bit more. He never cursed God. He still loved God, but he just had the wrong idea about suffering through, and leading to glory. God deals with Job's pride in verse 11 to 12, and we're going to deal a bit more of that section in an exhort in a week and a half's time. And the word proud occurs there twice as well. But let's just move on to verse 15. And in the smaller time that we have left, we're going to deal with the last two animals that God deals with. Two amazing animals. One's called Behemoth from verse 15 through to verse 24. And the other one is Leviathan, which is all of chapter 41. So hold on to your hats. Now, this is Behemoth. If we could actually put a chapter break up for Behemoth, possibly the hippopotamus. Verse 15 to 19, he's known for his physical strength. Verse 20 to 22 for easy lifestyle. It is really good reading. And verse 23 to 24, his self-confidence. Nobody can touch the hippopotamus. Very difficult to catch, very difficult to kill. And he lives at ease. Everything, all the food just comes to him, and all the water just comes to him as well. He's an amazing animal. Not everything sticks with this as well. There's one peculiarity with the hippopotamus. It talks about his tail being like cedar. Well, we know the hippopotamus, it does have a very strong tail at the start of the stem, but it just flops around after that. There's probably a hidden lesson in that, which we'll talk about shortly. But if anything, it's the only animal you could think of. Some people say maybe it's referring to an animal that existed before the flood. We won't go there. We'll just stick with this one as Behemoth, the hippopotamus. He's herbivorous in verse 15. He has strong legs and body in verse 16, a strong tail and muscular thighs, bones and limbs like brass and iron, teeth like swords. The food comes to him. He doesn't have to go to the food. He lives in marshes and reeds. He thrives in water and land. He's not affected by floods. It doesn't matter. He just floats or stays underwater for a long time. And he's very difficult to catch. And it'll definitely lend itself to being the hippopotamus. Why is Job being told this? After all the other animals, why did God leave out two animals, and particularly this one? Well, it's because Behemoth represents pride. He represents man, number one, because it says in verse 15, behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee on the sixth day of creation. He represents man. It's also in verse 19 as well. He is a chief of God's creation, of all those animals. He has great strength and endurance in verse 16 to 18. And what I've done there is I've got the little hyphen. I probably should have had a chart. There's Job. It represents Job and his own pride. So great strength and endurance, verse 16 to 18. Well, Job had great strength, but he also had great endurance, and that's why we've got James 5 there as well. Behemoth potentially thinks that he's better than he is, and that's why some commentators say about the tail, that Behemoth thinks that his tail is actually better than what it is, but it's just a little floppy tail at the end. And if that is the case, and I'm not really sure, I've never talked to a hippopotamus before to know what it thinks, but Job certainly felt that, and Job thought that he was a lot better than what he actually was. The behemoth is self-confident in verse 18 to 19, and so was Job. He was very self-confident, and he said, if I spoke to God, I would win the argument. And if God brought a book along, he would say, not guilty. The hippopotamus lives in ease in verses 20 to 22, and Job did. He had it all. He had everything in life. And in chapter 1, and he also stated all that in chapter 29 as well. People fell down and worshipped Job when he walked past, and he loved that attention as well. And he remains confident amidst disaster. Floods can come along. It doesn't affect the hippopotamuses. It washes a lot of other animals away, but not the hippo. And so Job, throughout this whole ordeal, remained confident. He even said in chapter 23, try me and I shall come forth as gold. Sorry for going through that slide too quickly. But he's overcome by no one in verse 24 but God. And so Job learnt that lesson, didn't he? It was God that inflicted the suffering on Job. And so he learnt that he is the behemoth. He had a great problem with pride. Just a few quotes on pride then. Proverbs 11, when pride cometh, then cometh shame. With the lowly is wisdom. Proverbs 16, Yahweh detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And we know all the quotes there as well, don't we? So God's plan, which Job muddied, which Job darkened God's plans by lots of words, God's plan has been to remove pride from Job's life. It wasn't easy. It was difficult. Look what he went through just to remove pride. But it worked, brothers and sisters. It worked. And Job's only reply to this is in chapter 42 when he prayed for his friends. And that's when he received his restoration. And more about that in an exhort. Chapter 41, and don't worry, we're not going to read every verse. We haven't thus far, and we're not going to do it in chapter 41. It's all about the animal called Leviathan. Verse 1, canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which letteth down? And if we were to put a chapter break up for all of chapter 41, Leviathan, potentially the crocodile, although some things don't fit either. It talks about a great steam coming out of its nostrils. I've never seen steam coming out of a crocodile's nostrils. And Trevor, you've been there as well. We've seen jumping crocodiles and the lot, and we've never seen steam coming out. Maybe it does on a misty day, I don't know. But everything else seems to fit a crocodile. He's untamable. You can't tame one. He's uncontrollable, very difficult to control. He's invincible, he's indestructible, and he's unconquerable. And this, without doubt, is talking about sin. Leviathan is sin. So what I'm going to do is just go through quickly most of the aspects of this Leviathan or this crocodile, and to show you how it relates to sin or aspects of sin. And it is quite fabulous how it all works out. You have to believe me, you can read through it in your own time. But he can't be bridled in verses 1 and 2. We saw that you can't throw a hook out with a yabby on the end and catch a crocodile. It's impossible to do that. So he can't be bridled, he can't put a muzzle around him either. So it represents the tongue. The tongue cannot be bridled. And of course, the tongue speaks great things and brings forth sin. So it's representative of sin in James chapter 3. You can't trust a crocodile. It's impossible to trust him. You can't make any supplication with a crocodile. If he sees you and you're in a difficult situation, he won't help you. He will eat you. And so we know that sin deceives. You can't trust sin, brothers and sisters. As soon as we start thinking about it, we end up committing it. It's hard to manage in verse 5. You can't play with him. You can't play with him as with a bird, which you can have on your arm. And so that we know that sin is enmity with God. You don't play with it. It's very difficult to manage. And we all know that in our own lives. You can't overcome sin. It's impossible to overcome sin. We're going to sin till the day we die. And we know that sin reacts with the spirit mind. The carnal mind reacts with the spirit mind. And we've got that battle there all the time. So therefore, It shouldn't be encouraged. You never encourage a crocodile. Hang out a piece of meat, it's going to come up and eat it. Throw your arms and legs over the edge of a boat and it'll eat them as well. And so Romans 14 says, well, don't encourage sin because it creates stumbling blocks to others. And we can be careful what we do in front of our fellow brothers and sisters, what we do. Things that might be good for us might not be good for someone else. And we can be careful what we do in front of others, where we cause them to sin as well. He's formidable. And we know that, well, we have a war in our members, says Romans. And there's a battle there all the time going on in our members. He can't be penetrated in verse 15 to 17. His scales are his pride, shut up together with a close seal. You cannot penetrate it. Try and knife him and you can't. It's very difficult on the top of his scales. And so we're told in 1 Timothy that when you sin, it affects your conscience and it sears your conscience like a hot iron. And it makes it very easy to keep on doing that same sin again and again and again. And sin's ugly. It's like the scales of a crocodile, which are like that hot iron and unable to penetrate. It's frightening to look at in verses 18 to 22 with its eyes and with its steam and all those things. And we know that James, when talking about the tongue, it sets nature on fire. When we wag our tongues and we say things that maybe we shouldn't, it's frightening, the things that we say, whether we say good things about ourselves or bad things about others. It's a frightening thing what our tongue can do. He's hard-hearted in verse 23 and 24. He cares for nobody. And so sin brings forth death. It gives wages. The wages of sin is death. It's hard-hearted. It'll give exactly what sin deserves, death. Weapons are useless against it. Crocodile Dundee had a few cracks at it. And that was useless for him as well. So we need to use the weapons of our warfare. I don't know why I said that. That wasn't planned. We need to use the weapons of our warfare, as Ephesians chapter 6 says, as well, to fight against sin. Take that out of the recording, please, Chris. It leaves a notable trail as well, with its huge tail and the way it slides across on the ground as well. And we know that envy and strife help no one, and it leaves a trail. And when we sin, when we don't help others, or we create difficulties in the meeting, it leaves a trail, and it leaves a trail of difficulty that needs to be cleaned up. It rules over all in verse 33 to 34, and we're told, let not sin reign in our bodies. And that was a quick call of Leviathan. Why finish with an animal representing sin? I think we understand pride, because Job had pride, as mentioned twice in verse 8 of chapter 40. Why finish with an animal representing sin? Because Job thought his righteousness was so great, his sin so little, that he didn't deserve such suffering. And God reminds him, this is what sin's like. Yeah, Job, you're perfect, upright, eschewed evil, you feared God. Doesn't mean that you're spot on and sin less. Sin is ugly. Sin needs to be sorted out. And you've got it in your life as much as anyone else has. And Job's taught this in a real way with these two animals. And John Roberts, in his book on the Job Study Guide, says this. One of the things consistently observed throughout these studies is that God is not answerable to man. God does not owe man anything. It is an important Bible truth that the salvation of men and women is not the be-all and end-all of God's purpose, God's manifestation. The salvation of those who love him is only the means to an end. It is the Lord who must be exalted, not man. God, not self, must be at the centre of the believer's life. God's purpose, as revealed in the Scriptures, is to fill the earth with his glory. By his grace, redeemed man is a part of that glory. God is working his purpose out, whether in the elements, animals, men, or suffering. The duty of man is just to trust God, even when he cannot see or understand the reasons for what he encounters. And we leave Job at that point. He's finally got the point. And he now is understanding that God has an even greater plan with him than he could ever have imagined beforehand. God's been on his side all the way through his goods and his bads, his trials and difficulties. And he's learned some great lessons that brings about his restoration in chapter 42. So finishing off some lessons, we must remove pride and self-righteousness from our life. How do you do that? I mean, you don't even know sometimes those things. Well, you do that by acknowledging the greatness of God and being humble before him, accepting that God is great and we're not. We must be aware of the lessons of nature, see purpose in animate and inanimate things that God has made. And there's lessons from the ostrich as there is for the raven or the ox as well. But not only that, we must appreciate God's plan of suffering before glory, see it as a creative process and count it all joy when it happens. And as Job was taught about all these creative animals and facts, he's taught that his suffering is only creating in him something better that can be used for help others or for his glory in the kingdom age. And not only that, brothers, sisters and young people, we must acknowledge the problem of sin in our life and do whatever it takes to change our ways before Almighty God. It is ugly, it is like the crocodile, and we must do whatever we can to change.